So in this video, I'm going to talk about managing your audience expectations and controlling your tone and your style in order to meet your audience's expectations. So the first thing to do, of course, is analyze who is your audience. In an academic or in a classroom setting, you often have a real and imagined audience. And so your real audience, of course, is your professor. Who is going to be grading it, and so you need to somehow meet their expectations. The imagined audience might be any number of things depending on what your professor has asked. And for the research paper, I'm asking that you imagine it to be other researchers. But for your next assignment, which is the blog post, I'm asking it to be a more general audience of people who are casually interested in the subject. So think very carefully about that. And the imagined audience is there to help you practice for real world audiences. And it's not uncommon for one argument to have many audiences, but be sure that you define your audience very clearly. Often when I ask people, who's your audience? And they're like, well, anyone. Really, anyone. Is anyone even going to be able to read this? So you have to think very carefully about how you're defining your audience. So also when you're keeping your audience in mind, keep your relationship to your audience in mind. You are the researcher, so you're the expert on your research. But when you're writing to other researchers, they're also experts in their own field. Their fields may intersect with your research, so you can assume a baseline familiarity with your subject, but don't assume that your audience has read everything that you've read either. In any case, do not talk down to your audience. Don't sort of try to baby them. Explain things, but explain things as a peer. So I've got some basic expectations about academic writing that I'm going to go over. Expectation number 1. There is no reader, there is no author either. I know this sounds exactly the opposite of everything I've said this semester up to this point, and it is ridiculous when you really think about it, but this is the way we write in academic writing. We use what's called the objective third person, and we use this even when we're talking about ourselves. So especially in science writing, you'll get these really weird sentences where it's like the researchers investigated and they're talking about themselves. Even in genres or fields where first person is accepted, such as in the humanities, and to curb that question right now, yes, you may use first person in this essay, but use it sparingly, as I'm about to say. Even where we is acceptable, we strictly avoid the second person. That is you. We don't say you. We pretend the reader is invisible. We can't see the reader, even though we have to take the reader into account. We never call out the reader or ask them to guess or participate. And when we do call out the reader in some way, often in signposting, it's informal commands that wouldn't even use you, such as saying, observe X or see Appendix A for more information. That's technically a command, but it's not done in a way that is like, you think about the last time you had breakfast. No, that's not what we do. We never do that. We never say, you can see from this evidence that, well, maybe they can't. You don't know. You don't know them. And we do not say things like, remember the last time that you went to the beach? Maybe they've never been to the beach. You don't know. So one of the things is, because with academic writing, our audience is so diverse, we just kind of build this wall. Think of it like in drama with the fourth wall, and we just pretend they're not there, even though they're the ones we're playing to. Expectation number 2, which is sort of the same, second verse, same as the first. Objective tone. In addition to controlling our pronouns and sentence structure, we also need to control our diction and use a fairly neutral or understated set of terms. We never use loaded words. For instance, I know one of the things that I got yelled at as an undergrad was I called an argument ridiculous, and my professor at the time said, no, we don't call other people ridiculous in academic writing. And I'm like, but they are ridiculous. And she said, yes, they are, but we don't say that. So you have to allow room for that counter argument. And so we don't call people names. We don't use really loaded language. Um, we understate at most, really. Um, we never call people idiots or foolish, and we always assume that a counter argument is at least a little bit reasonable, that there's something that they have as evidence for what they're saying, and we respect that. That doesn't mean that you can't take shots at other positions as needed. There's actually a lot of sniping going on in academic writing, um, but you kind of have to read very carefully to catch it. You have to be familiar with the way it's done because it's so understated. It's a little like watching British TV. If you're not used to it, you're like, I don't get it. Did they just, and everyone else is like, oh, sick burn. Yeah, it's just like that. They're slow and subtle. It's an advanced technique. I wouldn't even try it at this point. Try it when you've been reading a few things and you're so familiar with what they're saying that you're like, oh, I recognize that, and then start imitating it. We never oversell our case with excited language, and this is kind of similar to the we don't call people out. So we don't go like, this is the most important breakthrough since sliced bread. This is so important. That's a little hyperbolic, and it's annoying, and it's unspecific, and that's the real point here. So if anything, we risk understatement. The Greek term for this is litotes, and I love litotes. It's very common in Anglo-Saxon literature, side note, um, where you have a long list of the great achievements of such and such king, and then it ends with, that was a good king. That's the level of tone you want. You want to provide all that evidence, and then, that was a good king. Um, so uh, we we want to make sure that our readers are focusing on our evidence and our argument rather than our excitement about it, and so that's why we use such restrained language. This is very different from a lot of popular genres where we value those wide ranges of emotional tone. And is it a little outdated and maybe even a little elitist? Oh, yeah, there's plenty of room for that criticism. But my job right now is to teach you what is, not what should be. So, when you know the rules, you can break them deliberately, and please do, because that's how change happens. But you've got to learn the rules first, or else you're just being sloppy, and other people won't be like, oh, yeah, that's really innovative. You got to know what rules you're breaking first. Um, so, for an example of that, I mean, if you look at Picasso's early artwork, he can do photorealistic stuff, but then throws all that out the window because he's trying to do something else. So, think about working within the restraints first and then try to break the restraints. Um, Expectation number 3, use last names and never titles. So, along with that objective tone, we treat everyone with nearly equal status by using the author's last names after the first introduction. We don't use their titles or whatever. So if we have 2 authors, Professor Smith and Mrs. Jones, we refer to them exactly the same. We say John Smith and Emily Jones, and then after that, we just say Smith and Jones. We don't say Professor Smith. We don't say Mrs. Jones. We never do that. We just say Smith and Jones. There is a slight exception if you're doing a case study. We sometimes use first names to refer to case study participants to preserve their anonymity. So if we don't want to use their last names, or to emphasize that they are case study participants, or especially if they're minors, we would only refer to them by their first name and often a pseudonym given to them in order to preserve their anonymity. In your own discipline, you may find out that there are certain people who get certain titles of respect or camaraderie that is discipline specific. So when you're writing for a general academic audience, that's never going to be the case because you're not sure who you're writing to necessarily. If you need to mention a title, because sometimes titles matter, sometimes that's why we look to that person for information. You mention it in the first time that you introduce them, and you you bring it up in descriptions about them, but you don't use it to refer to them by name. So, for instance, one thing that you should always avoid is just like, oh, hey, this is an academic article, so obviously I need to use their institutional affiliation or whatever. Almost everyone who writes for academic articles has an institutional affiliation, has a terminal degree such as PhD, so we don't need to say that. But let's say you're talking about a law and you want to talk about one of the senators who worked on it and their specific statement about that law. Then the first time you introduce them, you might say Senator Jane Doe, or Jane Doe, Senator of such and such state, and then thereafter you just say Doe. Um, or maybe you interviewed an elementary school teacher for your project and you say something like John Smith, an elementary school teacher, noted in his interview that, and then afterwards you just say Smith argued. Um, this is writing, so your readers can go back and look at the previous stuff if they have to, if they forget. Expectation number 4, present tense. When in doubt, use the present tense. That means you say so-and-so says, not so-and-so said. For more detail, use the present tense when discussing what the author says in a published work, but the exception is sometimes for your original research in the interviews or observations or surveys, because those happen in an instant, in a particular moment. You can use past tense for that. Use your judgment, but when in doubt, just use the present tense. Expectation number 5, standardized format. Your readers expect a standardized format, and using that will make reading it faster. So use a style manual. It's not there to just be pedantic, it's there to take all those decisions out of your hands so that your reader can focus on the content. Expectation number 6, focus on evidence, on logos, and not ethos or pathos. You will build your ethos through your objective tone and your skillful use of evidence. So, like I said, this is not the case in every genre, but in academic writing, we want this objective tone, we want this focus on evidence, we want to treat everyone as equally as possible and as respectfully as possible. So those are my tips on expectations about this genre of academic writing.